Thank you, Cole, for inviting me. Thank you, George and Steve. It's exciting to be at a COSM again. George and I have a history going back to not only telecosm but power cosms. So, and I think we're, the line that history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. So here we are with rhythm again. It's great. So I'm not going to use slides. I thought I would just go commando on this. So it's a rare thing in the tech world, right? No slides, no PowerPoint. I think we should perhaps ban them, but that's a whole separate story. So in a few minutes, as Steve said, I'm going to try to highlight for you sort of the taxonomy, if you like, of the cloud. I'm going to tell you it's revolutionary. It's probably something you believe. But I'm going to do a macro framework, and I think one that's a little different than what's in popular circulation. We humans like taxonomies. We like categories. So the worldview that I want to present to you, I think, explains the proliferation of the so-called unicorn. You all know what unicorns are, not the mythological beast, the billion-dollar companies that are going public at a furious pace. I think it also explains why we're seeing this new rarefied club of public companies valued at over $1 trillion in the stratosphere. Like, wow. Maybe I should say as an aside, since we are wired to create categories, that we await the name to replace the unicorn with this $1 trillion club. So I have a proposal. It's kind of a Nordic proposal. I think we should use the Kraken. Well, that's the largest monster in mythology. It's the multi-tentacled oceanic giant that could engulf entire ships. I'm kind of stepping on Arthur Herman's Nordic turf here. You'll hear from him later, but I want to highly recommend his exquisite book, The Viking Heart. But I digress. So back to the real beast, the cloud. So its scale and reach does invite hyperbole. I think we don't have any conventions for how to define it, in fact. So I choose to take as a definition that the cloud encompasses everything from the endpoint devices to the wired and wireless networks to the hyperscale data centers and all of the micro and mini data centers in the edge network that collectively, because it's all connected in a single symbiotic multi-tentacled beast, that's the cloud. If we were measuring the cloud in the metric of merit of our era, bytes, we count it now in zettabytes. Everybody knows that Cisco talks about the zettabyte era. This is an ethereal number that's impossible to visualize. And ironically, data traffic is growing at a rate fast enough that we'll probably run out of numbers that officially exist to name the era. After yottabyte, there's nothing. I vote, by the way, for the brontobyte, but that is notional in the brontobyte. It's notional in the computer community. The unimaginative bureaucrats that control the naming nomenclature in Paris are not amused. Apparently, they don't want to call it a brontobyte. They're going to come up with something turgid, but that's the French. I love them. We could use a different metric that everybody understands. We could use weight to measure the cloud, one of the most ancient measures of all time. So, we manufacture the building blocks of the cloud, the silicon microprocessors, at atomic scale, but you can measure the quantity of microprocessors that we fabricate each year by the kilotons a year. I mean, it's just utterly astonishing. You could use energy as a metric, which I do frequently in an earlier book called Cathedrals of Commerce. It's the metric that the tech community is not really eager to embrace. It makes them nervous because they don't want to be accused of profligate energy use. Nonetheless, data centers, as you probably know, are not measured in square feet. The metric of merit in a data center is megawatts, not MIPS, megawatts. Think about that. Well, if the cloud were a country, it would consume twice the electricity of Japan, or in different energy terms, more oil than global aviation consumed before the great lockdowns. We could also count the cloud in the most cherished metric in Silicon Valley, probably Bellevue and everywhere, money. The capital spending on building out the cloud today is running at a higher rate in dollar terms and construction and CapEx than global spending on all the world's electric utilities. And you know, of course, which one is growing faster. Finally, let me use a metric for measuring the beast that really is perhaps the most important one. It's an economic metric. It's sort of in the same class of Paul's metrics. This is the measurement of computations available per second per constant dollar. Some of you may have seen this graph series, but the cloud is growing, measured in those terms, at about 100-fold faster than the Moore's Law rate. But as George framed this conference, we're today witnessing much more than the emergence of the cloud. We're seeing this kind of proliferation of seemingly divergent revolutions across a wide range of technologies. So what I want to talk about is a pattern that I think illuminates what George has also called the unities that animate all this. It's a pattern we've seen before. We don't see it very often. I'm referring to the technology-driven expansion of wealth and well-being that started roughly 1920, a century ago. The 1920s was the last time that we saw sort of a similar, it's almost identical in character, efflorescence of divergent technology revolutions. The effect of that was to create history's greatest expansion of well-being and wealth. I mean, I state the obvious, you know this, right? The average lifespan in America went up from 1920 to 2000 by 30 years, and the average per capita wealth in the United States increased in real terms by 700%. The roaring 20s of a century ago had actually, I think, a lot more in common with our times than just the convenience of nomenclature. The key thing is that last great boom didn't happen, let me state the obvious, right, because of one technology or one entrepreneur or one company. It happened because of the emergence of myriad, apparently divergent products and services. And the key here is within the three core technology spheres that constitute how we build everything that comprises civilization. I mean, these are, as soon as you state them, obvious. The first is our means for accessing and propagating information. The second domain is the one of machines, not least the means of production. And the third, that's the materials domain, with which we fabricate everything that exists. No materials, nothing exists in civilization because we have to reassemble the atoms of the limited numbers that are available in the periodic chart into very different things. Everyone knows what the iconic examples are from the 1920s efflorescence, right? But the technologies in each sphere. You know, it's the radio, telegraph, telephone. It was the car, the airplane. You can think of electric motor, and in the materials domain, of course, it was the revolution in chemistry, synthetic materials, polymers, and alloys, and not least pharmaceuticals. It's relevant to what I map out in my story for the 2020s is that it's critical to note that that efflorescence in the 1920s was from technologies that weren't invented then, but that were invented significantly earlier and reached contemporaneous commercial utility and maturation. That is the key. The future you can see in the immediate past of things that are entering commercial maturation. So, but today, we've got this prevailing view among economists that what we saw in the 1920s, the roaring 20s and beyond, was a one-shot deal. It was a one happenstance. There's some truth to that because the two of the three spheres are the domains of atoms, not bits. And as Peter Thiel correctly noted yesterday, the atom-centric domains haven't seen the same kind of progress that we've enjoyed in the information-centric domains. So we have a lot of economists talking about literally a, quote, new normal, a future of sort of endemically slow growth. If that were to be true, we would become continuously preoccupied with redistributing wealth rather than creating the frameworks that ensure a broad expansion of wealth for most people. So the point, of course, is that the information-centric domains have been fascinating, they have consumed us, and they properly consume us. They're consequential. But it's easier to apply information systems into information domains than it is in the domains of physical atoms and machines that affect life, where blue screen death is not just an inconvenience, but can be literally death. The news, entertainment, and financial industries have been the ones that have been most consequentially impacted by the information revolutions because they're information-centric domains. But they are collectively about 20% of the GDP. So the evidence that I map out of my book proposes that we're on the cusp of one of those other rare contemporaneous revolutions in the other two domains as well. Or you could use the modern word that was created in computer times. We're seeing a reboot in all three domains. For this audience, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the information-centric domains reboot. Let me just give as an example that we don't talk about, we've sort of taken for granted, is the increase in the number of nodes. The number of nodes on a communication networks matters. We know this because we have with us Bob Metcalfe, who has told us that and I'll paraphrase it this way, that the power of the network is certainly proportional to and amplified by the number of nodes. The dispute about the ratio, square, whatever the superscript is maybe in dispute, but the fact is clear. We've gone from a world, put this way, where there is essentially one wired node per household to one wireless node per person, to now, because the magic here is the disappearance of the radio as a chip-scale device, to now hundreds and thousands of radios per person infused into the fabric of things around us to help serve us, provide information about us. There's nobody else more knowledgeable about this phenomenal revolution than Carver Mead, whose incredible company impinges a sort of a classic example of this incredible physics challenge of having the radios become low-powered, harvest power, and disappear into the fabric of things. The data that gets generated from all this, of course, has to get mediated, digested, refined. That's what the cloud does, both as an amplifier of knowledge and a distributor and an amplifier of innovation. The other part of the cloud's reboot, of course, is in the inference engines. I don't have time in 17, maybe 18 minutes, Richard, to dig into the trope that AI as okay. AI as destroyer of the universe. I mean, I loved the delicious presentation from Peter Thiel on this. But AI is, in fact, actually implemented as hyper-specific. It is an amplifier of hyper-specific tasks. And it's not that it's not constitutional. Artificial intelligence imbued in a supercomputer is as different from the PC on a desk as an Apple IIe was different from an abacus. It is a consequential shift. But artificial intelligence as a scary thing is driven in large part by, I think, a nomenclature problem. I mean, I would phrase it this way. Peter famously has said, this is not even the right question, right? Well, that's because it's a category error. It's just to end the digression into AI, it's the equivalent of calling a car an artificial horse. This is a profound category error. Yeah, similar function. Okay, you get my point. So AI is additive and complementary. Yes, there are scary things about AI. There's scary things about nuclear energy. There's scary things about cars. 1 and 2 ton objects hurtling around in the hands of drunken college students that can. I mean, this has always been the case with technology, but that's another book. History. Let me give you an example of AI and logic, conventional logic. History has witnessed an analogous phenomena a century ago, the Roaring '20s. That's where we saw the emergence of both the automobile and the jet airplane a little bit later. They were both based on the same underlying materials in combustion theory and combustion technologies, but they yielded very different classes of services that are in fact complementary. So let me turn to the second domain, the rebooting there. This is the domain of machines. The obvious iconic example of a machines revolution are in those class of machines that now engineer, manufacture things literally, to use a Gen Z expression, literally at atomic scale. It's what Feynman imagined. It is a precision that we take for granted, but that is in fact unprecedented in history. What these machines allow us to do is, in effect, continuously find more room at the bottom. We could call Feynman space. And the other machine domain, and I just have to skip across some examples for you. Of course, after 2 decades of hype, we always have hype, are 3D printers, pioneered at the University of Texas, essentially, right? 3D printers are remarkable machines. They're sort of a new means of production that allows mass customization. But I think what's more consequential about 3D printers is that they effectively mimic how nature grows parts. That is consequential in the sense that it allows you to fabricate things that are impossible to machine with conventional machines, including, for example, and again, all my examples are not hypothetical, but things that have been invented already, including, for example, printing human organs. Use the magic Google machine, type in Dean Kamen organ printer. Dean Kamen is far more bullish than even I am on the advent of organ printing rather than organ transplant from hapless donors. Also in the machine domains, reaching maturity, you can't ignore the drone or air taxi. Look, the air taxi is typically called the flying car, and it's usually said derisively, and it's because it's been promised for so damn long. I mean, it was in 1940 that Henry Ford said that the flying car was imminent. Yeah, that's a little while ago. Turns out with a lot of things that people can imagine, engineering a useful product can take time. Andy Grove wrote a very good essay about the overnight revolution. Art Carver-Mead has talked about the overnight revolution of 20 years of building in Pinch. I think it was 2 decades, right? Right, Carver? I mean, overnight revolutions. It takes time to do these things. You can imagine them, but it takes time. Francis Bacon imagined powered flight 500 years ago. The Greeks thought about it, right? Even longer. In fact, the Greeks imagined maybe the most interesting machine of the coming era, which, of course, is the anthropomorphic robot. Yeah, you know, Arnold Schwarzenegger, the dystopian fiction. If you do a brief wade into the YouTube space and look for videos about anthropomorphic robots, you'll see incredible numbers of examples of not notional robots, but while they're pre-commercial, pretty fascinating executions of anthropomorphism in robots that will have an interesting practicality. The interesting thing about that particular machine is it's a general-purpose machine, just as the car is. And general-purpose machines are very difficult to predict in terms of how entrepreneurs will use them, as Jim has talked about. What people do with new things is hard to predict, but general-purpose technologies are consequential. I think we can, and I purport to prove in my book, I think we can say in the 2020s that we are now on the cusp of a Model T moment. We haven't had it yet, a Model T moment for an anthropomorphic robot. And after that, we'll get an industry as big as the auto industry. Let me turn finally to the third magisteria, which is materials science. It's possibly the most consequential and the least appreciated domain of revolutions. Obviously, materials matter. Nothing exists without materials. What's different about all of history prior to roughly 1900 and since then is chemistry. We had science that we could understand making synthetic materials, making polymers. The world is animated by this, even though we've come to be unhappy with the scale of some aspects of the chemical industry, but for chemistry, most of what we take for granted wouldn't exist. Our century is going to be the era of computationally engineered, computationally designed materials. We have a materials genome now, literally named that. Engineers are essentially performing alchemy in silico in supercomputers with AI-driven modeling and machine learning algorithms working from the quantum level. I don't think Feynman could even have imagined this. You're working from quantum models up and building materials based on properties we imagine. Sometimes we make materials that have properties that don't exist in nature, including invisibility. And in the material space, probably the one area where what Gail Pooley talked about last night, which is profoundly applicable, is the learning curve. We're on the tail end of a profound learning curve in materials science. Imagine, so the Nobel Prize, we have a couple of Nobel Prizes on something called self-assembling molecular machines. Machines that are molecular scale. This is even more imaginative than what Isaac Asimov had in, remember, Fantastic Voyage. And then we have the utterly bizarre new class of material. It's something that humans did not even know existed until about 20 years ago, which is graphene. I mean, let me just describe one property of a graphene sheet. So if you twist graphene sheets, monatomic layers of carbon, just so to a so-called magic angle, you get superconductivity, a new class of superconductivity. Who knew? We now know that those kinds of things are possible. There's a science fiction-esque quality to the emerging classes of materials. Self-cleaning materials, self-repairing materials, catalysts that might one day make possible cheap desalination or production of hydrogen, if you like, replace concrete, all manner of material revolutions that are as consequential as the advent of chemistry. You're going to hear a lot more about the materials revolution from Jim Tour. So it's magic stuff. I'm not going to steal your thunder, Jim. It's really exciting what you're doing in your labs. I'd be remiss in not making brief mention of energy-producing technologies. As a domain I spend a lot of time writing about, it is also a domain that's entirely dominated by the convergence of the three spheres, about information, about machines and materials. Exhibit A is nuclear energy. There's a lot of other examples of the information and machine and materials convergence. We have, however, no energy-producing machines revolution in sight yet. Yes, I know. I know about Teslas. I've heard about them. And I know about solar panels. I've heard about those too. I'm not going to go down the energy rabbit hole. That would take more than another 17 minutes. So let me just make two quick observations, just so that you can calibrate what constitutes revolutions. The revolutions in energy-consuming devices is epic and rampant now. Revolutions in energy-producing machines, not so much. Different sphere, something will come. But just so you can have this in your head, replacing internal combustion engines with electric vehicles, a lot more of which will happen because for many purposes, let's just stipulate EVs are better for many purposes. They're another useful option. But replacing internal combustion engines with EVs entails a 1,000% increase in the extraction, moving, and processing of primary materials to achieve the same road mile. That's a significant increase. And it's not amenable to easy bending from capital markets. China, by the way, has dominance in that supply chain, for what it's worth geopolitically, in the critical energy materials market. And its dominance in that space is far greater than the comparable dominance that OPEC and the United States have in oil and gas markets. Let me just put it this way and not beat this sad horse to death. Changing the fuel in a car, changing what you feed a car, leaves it a car. It's roughly as revolutionary, and it matters who makes the food, but it's roughly as revolutionary in the 19th century as changing how we fed horses. There were still horses. The car was a revolution. Different food for the car, it does not constitute a revolution, despite the politically favored memes around that. And let me just also add that the politically favored way to feed the electric car are solar panels, just so that you know that the energetics I just described, the 1,000% increase in primary materials required for the battery, also attend to the solar and wind domains. There's roughly 1,000 and as much as a 4,000% increase in critical materials to produce the same unit of energy if you use wind and solar instead of combustion. It's not that we can't do it, and it's not that it's not affordable in rich economies. It's just that it's consequential, and it's not revolutionary. In order to change the energy status quo, I'm going to invoke a local hero, not Bezos, but Bill Gates. They're dueling, I guess, they're dueling heroes in the Titan class that we have of our 2020s. Actually, I love Elon Musk because he is a genuinely dueling hero. If you read your history about the tech titans of the 1920s, they did the same kind of busting each other's chops. You know, when Carnegie Mellon died, Rockefeller was supposed to have said, "Who knew he wasn't a very rich man?" Rockefeller was worth $400 billion in today's dollars, and Carnegie Mellon was only worth a few billion. So, and he busted his chops on his deathbed. I mean, these guys, the same. In order to change the status quo in energy, Bill Gates has said we need, and he's been campaigning on this, an energy miracle. Now, a miracle, he wasn't being facetious, and he wasn't being theological, although there are theological aspects to the energy domain, which, as Cole knows, Peter Huber, my old friend who sadly died this year, he and I talked about it briefly in our book, The Bottomless Well, where we predicted contrafactual in that time that we weren't running out of oil and that there was an efflorescence of hydrocarbons. But what Gates is saying unequivocally is that what we need is a revolution in basic science. We need to have foundational discoveries. And he's right. We do. And I agree with him we should increase spending in basic science. And you can count me as an optimist that That's another feature of the cloud that promises that the roaring 20s will see discoveries. From discovery to technology is a very long road, as engineers know, but new discoveries matter. And we'll get them because of the cloud, because of sensors and the new class of materials, because that class of capabilities, and it's in the last 2 chapters of my book, are what I believe is bringing to the domain of the means of discovery revolutions as consequential as the invention of the microscope and the telescope. In fact, I think more consequential than those revolutions. In fact, a good example of what's coming, I think is kind of ironic and exciting to me, was when I listened to Ari Emanuel and looked at the videos that he was showing on what Octane Render can do to virtualize what objects are, models. This is precisely how science works. Scientists think in terms of models, and you want to render nature into models that are hyper-real and work in real time is an extraordinary feat and consequential at levels that have not been imagined. It's probably the single most consequential change in our means of discovery, and I'm being hyperbolic, in history. We are going to expand George's knowledge base in ways that are just astonishing in the coming decades. This is the most exciting time to live. Gen Zs are lucky. This is, talk about efflorescence of everything, except, well, I guess we also have an efflorescence of stupidity, but those episodes are brief, but they always repeat themselves, as Neil Ferguson has shown us. So let me end with this. Look, you can obviously count me. Time to end? No. You can count me an optimist. The book title is an optimistic. I sound like an optimist. I'm an optimist. I like to though say that I'm not the last optimist. I don't think I'm an optimist. I'm a realist. What I've described for you, what's in my book, is realism. Yeah, it's what's going on. George knows this. The COSM is about this. Now, who makes money and who loses? I've been there, done that. That's not so easy. But that's the tumult. That's what's exciting. Yeah, we got problems. Gee, what a surprise. Who knew? The world's in tumult. Google up your history. You don't have to be a brilliant historian like Neil Ferguson. Google machine, 1920, what was going on at that time. The Bolshevik Revolution, fears of communism taking on America, massive race riots, massive strikes shutting cities down, thousands of troops and police deployed, blacks and whites killing each other. It was a time of the odious, profound scientific eugenics movement that all of the intelligentsia and all of the major universities embraced and endorsed as settled science. What a grotesque theory. And it ran rampant, and it actually fed Nazism and fascism. And Hitler said, but for the eugenics movement, I wouldn't have, I'm paraphrasing, I wouldn't have had the toolkit that I needed. We had a lot more going on. We had prohibition. Think about it. A constitutional amendment to ban consumption of a substance that humans have created and enjoyed since before written history. Banned for 13 years. When Congress passes stupid laws, they're sticky. 13 years that ban existed. I could go on about what was going on in the 1920s, much more than that. It was a time, as Neil Ferguson and I quote in my book, we had a campaign for presidency on a return to normalcy. So let me finish with this one last thought. Neil Ferguson said we just exited a horrible war, a pandemic at that time. We did. The pandemic lasted into the 1920s, by the way. But it was a time after which, from 1920 to the year 2000, again, we had the greatest efflorescence and well-being and wealth in all of human history. You know what they say, I'll say it again, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. The rhythms are in place today. Thank you.